This comes out of a much bigger paper that I have written, and this is just one chapter of that. Looking at contradictions. Contradictions, now you might ask, and David kind of brought this up at the beginning of his talk. Wait, what's going on here? You're first talking about the historical problems with the Qur'an, which suggests Muhammad had nothing to do with the Qur'an. And now you're talking about, and say, well, hold on a minute. Now you're talking about the Qur'an as a book, which seems to suggest you're just contradicting yourself. Maybe you'll notice there are two forms of criticism that we're introducing at this conference. One is what we call internal criticism, which looks at the Qur'an as it is. That's what David was just doing. He's looking at the Qur'an as it is. He's not doing a historical assessment here of whether or not that book comes from a man named Muhammad living in the 7th century, like I did in the talk earlier. From an internal standpoint, you can criticize the Qur'an looking at it as it is. And the same thing with Muhammad. You can look at what Muslims say Muhammad is, and you can then confront him. And David has been doing this with Islamicize Me. I mean, amazing what they have done, looking at what all the authoritative sources say about this man Muhammad, what he said, what he did, and how ridiculous he is for today. That's the internal critique. Externally, then, we have another critique, and that is, wait a minute, is any of this true? Do we know if any of this took place? Was there even a man named Muhammad? Did he exist from 570 to 640 to 632? And do we know whether or not he was the one that was given this book? Like the question that David turned to me, and he says, do you really believe in Mecca? That's a good question. And for David to ask that question, I have to depend on what is it I'm critiquing. Internally, I have to accept that there must be a Mecca there, because the Quran accepts that there's a Mecca there, and so do all the traditions. Externally, I want to destroy that completely, because history tells me there was no Mecca at all. So we're going to sound a little bit schizoid, but what I do with my Muslim, it depends on who's standing in front of me. And I'll do the internal critique with those who do not have the capacity to even question the historical critique. Then I've got to deal with them internally. I've got to deal with the Quran as it is in my hand. And this is what we're going to do now. So I'm following on from David, looking at the contradictions. You might say, well, hold on a minute. You don't even think that the Quran is from Muhammad. I didn't say that. That's not important. For this talk, we're looking at the Quran, which is in our hands. Does it have contradictions? And the answer is absolutely. It has huge contradictions, which is fascinating, because in the Quran itself, it starts from the premise that there are no contradictions. Chapter 6 verse 34 and chapter 10 verse 65 said, there is none that can alter the words and decrees of Allah. So it starts from that premise that you won't find any contradictions internally in the Quran. Even more damaging is a pronouncement made in chapter 4 verse 82, which says, do they not consider the Quran, had it been from other than Allah, they would surely have found therein many discrepancies, many contradictions. So it makes that claim. You can find contradictions, that it cannot be from Allah. So it's very clear the Quran sets itself up with the dictum that there are no contradictions. Muslims authorities therefore try to explain the contradictions that do exist. Listen, there are about 225 contradictions. Well, hold on a minute. It depends on who you're talking about, because we even have some Muslim scholar, Jalaluddin, numbers the contradictions between 5 to 500. Others say there are about 225. So even Muslims themselves don't know how many contradictions. The paper that we're going to give you tomorrow, I've listed about 50 contradictions, and some of those I'm going to go through today. But what's fascinating is Muslims themselves don't even know where these contradictions are, but they do know that they are aware there are contradictions. So what they have done is they have built a law of abrogation into the Quran, chapter 2 verse 106 and chapter 16 verse 101. 106 and verse 108 and 16 verse 101. Some would also add chapter 17 verse 86, which say we substitute one revelation for another. Chapter 16 101 goes into more in clarity. If it were our will, we could take that away, that which we have sent thee by inspiration. That's chapter 17 verse 86, excuse me. Or we could substitute. What does it mean by substitute one with the other? That which we give would be mansuk. That's the word they give. Mansuk means weak. We substitute it with something which is stronger or better, nasik. So nasik always abrogates mansuk. Mansuk would be your Meccan surahs, nasik would be your Medinan surahs. And that's how most Muslims explain it. That when you look at these different periods or areas of the Quran, you really have two gradations based on two cities. Which is fascinating because though the Medinan surahs are at the beginning of the Quran, the Meccan surahs come later. It's the Mansukh surahs in Mecca which are actually the earlier in time, revealed to Muhammad between 610 and 622. And it was only from after 622 that he moved into, actually it's the other direction, that from 622 then he moved in and moved to Medina. If that is the case, then you need to ask your Muslim friends, how can you have contradictions within a 22-year period? What's the answer to that? Muslims will say that these are nothing more than progressive revelation. Now, where do you think they got that from? Where does progressive revelation come from? That's a biblical academic term. That's what most Bible scholars talk about when they're referring to what's happening in the Old Testament versus what's happening in the New Testament. And there are many seeming contradictions between the old and the new, am I correct? Especially on the one with violence. I'm surprised no one brought this up yesterday when we were talking about peace. Because when you look at peace in the New Testament and the violence in the Old Testament, you seem to have a contradiction between the two testaments. And many Muslims will bring this up to you, and they'll say, how can you deal with this seeming violence? Well, not seeming, it is very violent, and seeming peace in the New Testament. Does God contradict himself? Did God change his mind? How do you answer that? Probably the easiest answer is going to chapter 5 just chapter 5 of Matthew. Matthew chapter 5. I love Matthew chapter 5. Because Jesus answers it for us. In verse 17, you have heard it say, for I have not come to destroy the law. That's the Mosaic law, 1400 BC. I have not come to destroy the law, I have come to fulfill it. There's the answer right there. And the operative word is fulfill. Not to destroy that law, but to fulfill it. Now, he doesn't leave us hanging. Then he gives us 6 applications, 6 different ways of what he means by that. And he says, you have heard it say, but I now say. You have heard it say, and that's in verse 38, for eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But in verse 39, he says, but I now say. What do you mean, I now say? What's he talking about? Here is a new law. Here is a new covenant. Here is a New Testament. And that's why we call it a New Testament. But I now say, turn the other cheek. So the old Mosaic law is eye for an eye. But now I say, turn the other cheek. For you have heard it say in verse 43, to love your friends and hate your enemies, right? That's the Mosaic law. That's 1400 BC. But I now say, to love your enemies. Ooh, I love that. See, that's a much different law. That's a much more difficult law. How do you love your enemies? You won't find in any other revelation anywhere in the world. There is nobody that comes up with that but Jesus Christ. Is it 2 different laws? Yes, it is. It is 2 different laws. And of course, Muslims say, well, then what has God done? Has he contradicted himself? Has God changed his mind? What I like to do whenever this comes up, I like to use my own 3 sons. I have 3 sons, and at one time, one was 6 years old, one was 12 years old, and the other was 16 years old. Don't ask me why. We don't plan a thing in my family. But 6, 12, 16. Now, I look at myself and I say, look at my sons and look at the way I treat my sons. My 6-year-old, they're in London. I don't let him go outside the door, because if he goes out this door as a 6-year-old, he'll be hit by a bus and he'll be killed. So I have rules and regulations for him that are very stringent. I want to protect him. I say this, that, the other. I don't do this, don't do that. I am a good father. I have laws for him to protect that 6-year-old son. And that's much like the Mosaic period in 1400 BC. Here you had the Israelites. They'd been for 400 years in captivity. They are now coming out. They're hitting all these other people they've never come across before. God needs to protect them. So he has rules and regulations to maintain that security, but also to eradicate any other influence from outside, because anybody can control these children. So they're so naive, like my naive son who's 6 years old. So they need a whole set of laws that's different than my 12-year-old. See, my 12-year-old, I let him go all over London by himself. As a 12-year-old, he has now learned how to deal with the buses. He knows how to deal with the transportation. Not my 6-year-old, but my 12-year-old. So I have a whole new set of laws, much more, you might say, freeing, but a lot more responsible. He has to be a lot more responsibility than my 6-year-old. And that would be like what we have with Jesus 2,000 years ago. When Jesus comes, he comes with a whole new set, not of laws. If you notice, look at what Paul says, but principles. These principles that you see all the way through Paul's letters, the principles they use in Galatia, he doesn't say in Ephesus. The principles he used in Ephesus, he doesn't use in Philippi. And the principles he used in Philippi, he certainly doesn't use in Rome. The principles are contextualized depending on where he is. These principles from the 1st century AD are still applicable today. That's the beauty of this new covenant, this new testament. Now, the question is, God had one law for Moses and one law for the people there in the 1st century. Did God change? Did God change his mind? Who changed? The people changed. Like my sons have changed. I, as a father, have 2 different laws for 2 different sons. I haven't changed at all, and I apply both laws simultaneously, for both sons at the same time. I'm not the one that changes. My sons change, just like the children of Israel changed. Now, I have another son over here. He's 16 years old. Here comes 600 years later, after Jesus Christ, another man comes onto the planet, is born, is grown up, and he comes with a whole new set of laws called Sharia law. His name is Muhammad. And take a look at his law. Suddenly it's rules and regulation, how to walk, talk, eat, drink, sleep, 24/7. They're so proud of the fact that they can take care of every area of life, because that's what Sharia law does. It's almost, looking at that law, it's very similar to Mosaic law. When I look at these 2 laws, I say, hold on a minute. You've just regressed me back to 1400 BC. Have you noticed how similar Islamic law is to Judea law, Mosaic law? Can you imagine me as a father treating my 16-year-old like my 6-year-old? Would I do that as a father? Absolutely not. God does not regress us back 600 years later, back to Mosaic time. We progress so that we in the 21st century, we can look at what God gave us there in the 1st century, and we can see that we can live by that law in any place, at any time, anywhere, with anyone. There's the beauty of the person of Jesus Christ. Talk about abrogation. No, God does not abrogate himself. He does not contradict himself. Our God not only fulfills what he promised back there, but he gives us the Holy Spirit, the Paracletos, to make sure that we follow this law. And that's what is applicable today. And there's the beauty of it. Use that as an application and show that God is not contradicting himself. He is actually making even more relevant even today. Now let's look at some of these. I don't know how much time I have. As soon as I assume you stand up, that means I got to shut up, right? Or do I look at, you're looking at her, so I got to listen to you. Okay. I know I've been given half the time of David, so I'll try to keep it to half the time of David. I can actually speak all fast if you want me to, but most people don't follow me when I speak fast. You know what my Korean students do? They take me, they record me, then they take me home, and they put in these special recorders which slow down my voice, so I sound. I have a beautiful baritone voice. I sound beautiful when I hear it, when the Koreans do that. That's the only way they can keep up with me, because they think I talk too fast. I don't think I do. Let's go on. And let's start with some of the, now there's so many, I don't want to go through all of them. I'll just give you some examples of some of these abrogations, these contradictions. And if the words of Allah cannot be changed, Surah 6, verse 34, and verse 115, and chapter 10, verse 6, then how does Allah substitute one revelation for another in the very thing we've just talked about? Surah 2, ayah 106, and Surah 16, ayah 101. Can you see there's a contradiction right there? And just the whole law of abrogation is contradictory by definition. The law of abrogation in Surah 2, ayah 106, contradicts sweeping changes in the Qibla, chapter 2. Also in the pilgrimage, chapter 2, verse 158. In dietary laws, chapter 2, verse 168 to 174. Also in the law of Talio, in chapter 2, verse 178 to 179. In the bequests, in chapter 2, verse 180 to 182. In the fasts, 180 to 187. And in the pilgrim again, in chapter 2, verse 196 to 203. Don't look these all up. I'm going too quick. But you can use this paper and actually look at these yourself. Here's another one. Does Allah's day equal 1,000 human years, according to chapter 22, verse 47 and 32:5, or 50,000 human years in chapter 70, verse 4? Ooh, that's a good one. Is it 1,000 or is it 50,000? Where is Allah in his throne? Is he nearer than your jugular vein, chapter 50, verse 16, or is he also on the throne, chapter 57, verse 4, which is upon water in 11, verse 7, which, while at the same time so far away that it takes between 1,000 to 50,000 years to reach him, in chapter 32, verse 5. You can see, you can play all kinds of games with these contradictions. Here's one I always like to have. Can Allah have a son? In chapter 39, verse 4, it says very clearly, if God so had willed it, he could have a son. Yet in chapter 4, verse 157, and in chapter 6, verse 101, it's very clear that God cannot have a wife nor a son. So there's an internal contradiction. Was the earth created in 6 days in chapter 7, verse 54, in chapter 25, verse 59, in chapter 32, verse 4? Or was it created in 2 plus 4 plus 2, which means 8 days, in chapter 41, verse 9 to 12. That's a good one to do a comparison of, because look at the sequence between the 7 days and also the 6 days and the 8 days. If you do a comparison, you find even the sequences are wrong. Ooh, I love that one. That's an easy one. Does the angel Gabriel bring the revelation from Allah to Muhammad in chapter 2, verse 97, or is it the Holy Spirit? Now, there's a good one, because in chapter 6, verse 16, verse 102, because then you need to ask, who is this Ruh Allah? The Ruh Allah, is he a individual or is it Gabriel? Bring that up. There's a good one to unpack. If the Quran is pure Arabic in chapter 12 and also chapter 13 and chapter 16 and chapter 41, then why are there numerous foreign words? If you want to look at the words, we have a whole litany of example after example of Egyptian, Akkadian, Assyrian, or Aramaic, Persian, Syriac, Hebrew, Greek, and Ethiopian, which begs the question, why so many foreign words? And the reason why is what David has just said. All of these, in every case when you see these foreign words, they are stories that are borrowed from every one of these sources. That's why so much of the Quran is borrowed. It's full of borrowings. I love the one you had with chapter 5, verse 31. Actually, the one that it's the Sanhedrin is not verse 31. That's not the first time it was given. If you look at Jonathan ben Uzziah, in Jonathan ben Uzziah's work, which is from the 2nd century, not from the 5th century, but the 2nd century, you have the story of Cain and Abel. Cain killing his brother, doesn't know what to do with the brother, so he follows what the raven is doing. It's not till we get to this Bar Sanhedrin, which is fascinating, because when the Jonathan ben Uzziah was being written in the 5th century, the scribe that was writing it down in the early 5th century, reading the story about Cain and Abel and the raven burying his brother, he then writes in the margin with his own hand, he who takes the blood of one is if he takes the blood of all, but he who saves the blood of one is if he saves the blood of all. That was an editorial comment written by the scribe on the margin of the text he was copying. In the late 5th century then, when someone came across to copy this and put it into a formal form, he took the story from Jonathan ben Uzziah of the raven and Cain and Abel, and they took this editorial comment and introduced it into the text. So in the Bar Sanhedrin in chapter 4, verse 5, you not only have the story of Jonathan ben Uzziah of Cain and Abel, but you also have the editorial comment written by a scribe introduced as part of the story. It's nothing more than a redemption analysis on the blood of Abel. Which is why when they put it into the Quran, did you notice in the Quran, what did they change? The only thing they changed between the Bar Sanhedrin is, O children of Israel. They put, O children of Israel at the top, saying that this is for the children of Israel. And that's why when Obama and many of your pundits, whenever they say this is proof that the Quran is a book of peace, and they always love to quote verse 32. He who takes the blood of one is if he takes the blood of all, but he who saves the blood of one is if he saves the blood of all, without even looking at the very beginning of that surah. Of that ayah. O children of Israel, that's chapter 5, verse 31 and verse 32. Verse 32 belongs to the Jews. It's right there at the top of the line. This has nothing to do with people like you or me. It has nothing to do with Muslims, and it certainly has nothing to do if you're not a Jew. If you want to find out what we're to do, read the very next verse. Look at verse 33, because verse 33 is very clear. He who does not accept Allah as God and Muhammad as his prophet, crucify them and cut off their hands and feet from opposite ends. That's our punishment. So use that whenever someone brings this up as a verse of peace. This has nothing to do with Muslims. It's to do with Jews, written by a scribe, one in the 2nd century and another in the 5th century. Let's continue on. The infinite loop, Surah 26, verse 192, 195, 196, and Surah 41, verse 43 to 44, say that the Arab Quran is found in the earlier revelations, the Torah and the Injil, but that they are written in Hebrew and Greek, and we know they don't contain all that is found in the Quran, chapter 41, verse 43. Hence, these earlier writings have to be contained in yet other writings, written writings, and we are in an infinite loop, which is absurd. You just go around, and you can see the contradiction just becomes an infinite loop once you start getting and unpacking it. Another one, does the newer revelation confirm the old? That's you find in Surah 2, Ayah 97, or substitute it, chapter 16, 101. Does it contain it or substitute it? And there you bring in the law of abrogation once again. If the Bible is considered authoritative in chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 10, chapter 21, oh, there's so many of these. I mean, David, how many have you found Yeah, showing how the Bible is authoritative. A dozen? Dozens and dozens. There are so many verses that show the authority of the Bible, that show the authority of the Bible. If this is the case, then why is it so much of it contradicted by the Quran itself in chapter 5, verse 73, in chapter 19, in chapter 20, and there's so a litany of contradiction after contradiction between the Bible and the Quran. In fact, there's a whole paper we've written just on the contradictions between the Bible and the Quran. In chapter 30 and also 16, everything is devoutly obedient to Allah, yet what about the proud disobedience of Satan? Is the evil in our life from Satan in chapter 4, from Allah in chapter 4 verse 78, or from ourselves in chapter 4 verse 79? Can you see these internal contradictions have a lot of theological implications, and that's why they're great to get into discussions once you bring them up. In chapter 5 verse 82, Christians are the nearest to the Muslims in love, yet in chapter 5 verse 51 and verse 57, Muslims are not to have anything to do with us. They are to refrain from having any contact with us because they are not to be our friends. Now, I can see I'm running out of time. How much time do I have left? 7 minutes. Well, these are going to take too long. Let me just try to pick out some ones that are pretty easy. Allah stipulates that those who break an oath do so on forfeit of their soul, chapter 48, verse 10, yet permits Muhammad to break an oath in chapter 66, verse 1 and 2. Sometimes Allah allows the greatest of all sins, shirk, to be forgiven in chapter 4, verse 153, and also chapter 25, verse 68, while at other times it is absolutely unforgivable in chapter 4, verse 48, and also 116. For Allah, the unpardonable sin is the sin of shirk. We've seen that over and over again, chapter 4, verse 48, and also verse 116. Yet Abraham committed this, but by initially believing the moon, sun, and stars were his Lord in chapter 6, verse 76 to 78. So Abraham committed shirk. At some point you have in chapter 3, verse 84, that all prophets are equal. That's also repeated in 2:28 and also 2:136. Or are some elevated above the others in chapter 2, verse 253. If the inheritance law proves an equal share for women and men, then what are we going to do when it is doubled for men in chapter 4, verse 11? Is the punishment for adulteresses life imprisonment in 4:15, or 100 strokes and flogged by flogging in 24:2? And why is it that homosexuals are let off if they repent in chapter 4, verse 16, though the same allowance is not given to heterosexuals in chapter 24, verse 2? Can a rich man buy himself out of a fast by feeding an indigent in chapter 2, verse 184, or someone who is poor, or is there really no compensation in 2, verse 185, the very next verse? There's a contradiction between the two verses. Now here's an interesting one, and this is one that I like to bring up. I brought this up at Speaker's Corner a few times, and Muslims did not know what to do with it. Now, look at chapter 4 and look at the inheritance laws in chapter 4. Especially verse 11 to 12 and verse 176. There it specifies that when a man dies and leaves, and if he has 3 daughters and 2 parents and a wife, okay, the 3 daughters will receive 2/3 of his inheritance, 1/3 will go to his parents, and 1/8 for his wife. That's in 4 verse 11 and 4 verse 12, which adds up to 112%. Can you see the problem there? I did it with my own family. I want to see what would happen if I died. So if I were to die and I had my mother, my wife, and my 2 sisters were still living. When I did this, my mother was still living at that time. She's now deceased. But if my mother, my wife, and my 2 sisters were still living, then my mother would receive 1/3 of my inheritance. That's in chapter 4, verse 11. My wife would receive 1/4 of my inheritance. That's in chapter 4, verse 12. And my 2 sisters would receive 2/3 of my inheritance. That's in chapter 4, verse 176, which then adds up to 133%. Now, can you understand then why everybody's going to court when someone dies? Because if you're going to follow the Quran, you don't know either who wrote the Quran didn't know his own mathematics, or this is nothing more than fraudulent. I would assume that both are correct. Did Noah's son drown in chapter 11, verse 42 to 43, or were Noah and his family saved from the flood in chapter 21, verse 76? Oof, that's a good one. Did Abraham confront his people and smash their idols? That's a story that David brought up in chapter 21, verse 51 to 59. Or did he simply shut up and leave the area once he confronted them in chapter 19, verse 41 to 49? and not destroy the idols. So you have a historical anachronism here. Did Abraham destroy the idols, or did he not destroy the idols? When were there 9 plagues or signs in chapter 17, verse 101, which is referring to the plagues of Moses, or only 5 in chapter 7, verse 133? Interestingly, if you look at Yusuf Ali and also Hilali and Khan, they try to get out of this. They realize that this is a problem. You can't have, because this is a numerical difficulty, you can't have either a 9 or 5. So what they try to do is they try to add the leprous hands and the rod and the draughts and the short crops. But there's nothing in the text to support that. He's gone to the Bible to find out this. He's gone to our scriptures to find out these other ones to then add to make it the 9. Did the Israelites repent about worshiping the golden calf before Moses returned from the mountain in chapter 7, verse 148, or after Moses came back in chapter 20, verse 91? I think Moses would love to know. Did Aaron share in their guilt? According to chapter 20, no, he did not. But that's verse 85. But if you go to chapter 20, verse 92, and chapter 7, verse 151, he did share in their guilt. So I think Aaron would like to know if that were true. Were there several angels who announced the birth of Jesus to Mary in chapter 3, verse 42, or only one in chapter 19, verse 17? And you're standing up, so that means my time to shut this down. These are all here. You can unpack these. In fact, just take them and work this through with your Muslim and show them that, listen, this kind of mistakes we would expect from a man-made document. We make mistakes all the time. I've been making mistakes purposely, showing you I don't even read it correctly sometimes. I have to correct myself. That happens quite normally. As humans, it's open to human error. But if this is God's eternal word, if this is the word that exists in those eternal tablets, according to chapter 85, verse 22, how can you have errors like this? How can you have contradictions like this? Why do you even have a law of abrogation? Why is that even needed? Do we have a law of abrogation in the Bible? Thank good we don't. Now, I remember back in 1997, I did a debate with Dr. Shebet. He wasn't doctor at that time. My first debate I did with him was at Birmingham University. And in the middle of the debate was on the Bible and the Qur'an. He handed me a book of 101 clear contradictions of the Bible back in 1997. So that's so long ago. My goodness, 20 years ago. I went back with 3 other friends, and the next year I did another debate with him, and this was in Leicester University when we could do debates. And I handed him back, and the title of his book is 101 Clear Contradictions of the Bible. I handed him back the same paper a year later, 101 Cleared Up Contradictions of the Bible. And you can get it. We'll put it on and we'll give it to you if you want it tomorrow. We went through every one of those contradictions. We found that Shabir Ali and all his friends, because he didn't himself do it, this has been around for about 20 to 30 years, had gone through and they had made 15 mistakes. We found there were you could put them into 15 categories. Sometimes they didn't read the whole text. Sometimes they didn't even read the next verse. Sometimes they had no idea about one word, the definition of a word, or even the definition of a phrase. So we went through every one of them, and we showed right at the very beginning what the mistake was, just in one sentence, and then we unpacked it if you want to get into more in depth. And I handed it back at him. Now, this is 1998. He has not returned it back to me since. That's 20 years ago. He doesn't know how to defend this. See, that's the beauty of our Bible. We don't have these kind of contradictions. Once you know the context, and that's the problem with Muslims, they are not used to looking at context. Have you heard David and I say that a few times today? There is no context in the Quran. But there is in our Bible. That's the beauty of our Bible. These contradictions do not fall. We do not have this problem. And the other great thing is we don't have a context of what we call nazil. See, Islam is dependent on nazil. Nazil means sent down. The Quran, they believe, was sent down without any human intervention from God via the angel Gabriel to a man named Muhammad. That means there's no intervention at all. Well, we've just given you a smattering of the 225 that we have found. We would never make that claim about the Bible, and yet you can't find even one contradiction. Come on home.